Welcome to a question and answer episode of the Old Frontline podcast with me, military historian Paul Reed. In these bonus episodes, we'll answer questions that you, the podcast listener, have sent in, and each episode will take us down new avenues and hopefully fascinating ones to talk about some of the smaller subjects of the Great War that we can't always cover in the main episodes. So let's hear this week's questions. Welcome to the 9th episode of Questions and Answers. This is a bonus episode that we release between the main podcasts where you, the listeners, can submit questions on any aspect of the Great War, and I do my best to answer them. We're on a bi-weekly cycle for main episodes at the moment, and that'll continue on into the summer with these Q&A episodes in between. And with the regular amount of questions that are coming in and the positive feedback that I'm getting on these Q&A episodes, they're proving quite clearly very, very popular. And there's lots and lots of really good questions still coming in, so keep those coming. And you can submit, as usual, your questions via two main methods, and there's details of this in the show notes. That's either via our Discord server, where you can go on there and post a question, or you can click and email me a question direct. And it's taken a few weeks between submitting a question and getting it answered here, simply because there's so many of them, but they're great questions, so keep them coming. And we've got a really good selection in this week's episode. So let's begin. Question 1 this week comes from Matt Rowe on email. Matt asks, "This may be a bit too niche, but it's something I wonder about as a collector and shooter of vintage military rifles. Have you come across anything to suggest the average soldier may have been picky or selective about the rifle they carried? If we take the short magazine Lee Enfield as an example, collectors place a high premium on pre-1916 rifles due to their extra features, magazine cut-off, volley sights, etc., or certain low-output manufacturers such as LSA, London Small Arms, for their rarity. Would a pre-war regular cling on to his pre-1916 rifle for its extra features? Would a soldier from London prefer an Enfield or an LSA-made rifle, or a man from the Midlands be happier with a British Small Arms as a talisman of home?" Now that's a great question, Matt, as a collector of military weapons. But I'm going to be absolutely honest from the outset. I don't think that many soldiers were aware of those kind of details. In the regular army before the war, that was a period during those Haldane army reforms when the army was completely reformed and soldiers were trained to that almost kind of mythical level, 15 rounds a minute. We know that others could fire a lot more than that, but that was the kind of standard level of musketry, of ability to use your Lee Enfield rifle. There was a high placement on the ability of soldiers to use those weapons. Whether the soldiers kind of related that to where the rifle was built, I don't think so. But of course the features that you mentioned, which was the cut-off and the volley sights, that would have been part of their training. So, of course, they would have really seen the benefits of those. Once the war began, and of course some of those, like the sights, were for service in places like the northwest frontier of India. And once they got to the battlefields of France and Flanders, and that regular army went to war in August 1914 and fought from Mons to Le Cateau to the Marne, the Aisne, First Ypres, I'm not sure there would have been much of an opportunity to use those kind of sights, that they were firing in quite close range at an enemy coming across open ground, which they could lay a lot of musketry, a lot of rifle fire into, and inflict heavy casualties, as they did at places like Mons and on the flanks and positions at Le Cateau. And you read a lot about this in the First Battle of Ypres, fighting around Polygon Wood and places like that. But I don't think that the soldiers kind of had a particular connection to where a rifle was made or just its features, but I think they were connected to their own rifle. I mean, I remember interviewing some soldiers who were kind of desperate to hang on, almost like as a talisman, the weapon that they carried since they went overseas. When they were wounded or went sick and they had to be handed in, then they weren't too keen on losing it because it was a weapon that had proved to be efficient for them, and several cases I can think of that have kind of saved their life as they brought their weapon into action and engaged the enemy, and it was the enemy that had been killed rather than them. So I'm not so sure about that. And I think as the war went on, I think soldiers who were in the army placed less and less importance on the features that you mentioned, and I would say almost no importance on where the actual weapon was built. They might have turned a weapon over and looked at it, and the lads from the Birmingham POWs might have really been pleased to have a weapon made by BSA, for example, but I don't think that kind of meant as much to them as it does to you as a collector. And if you look at the way soldiers were trained once the new army was formed, musketry was only a very small part of their training. If I look at the South Downs battalions that I've followed for many years, they only had drill purpose weapons, so they were weapons that had DP painted on the butt of the rifle, indicating that you could use them to march up and down and practice drill, but they weren't for use on a range. And they didn't fire really their proper weapons until they got to Aldershot and places like that in 1915, and that wasn't uncommon for a lot of Kitchener's units. And once you get to a conscript army in 1916, then I think the emphasis on the training for musketry, which was complex and difficult to teach a man how to shoot a rifle properly, then that became less and less. And I remember reading that they got to about 1917 and the emphasis had been placed not on small arms fire, not the ability to use your rifle, but on close range weapons like grenades. So soldiers could very proficiently use Mills bombs, but they couldn't shoot their rifle very well. And in the latter part of the war, there was a kind of turn against that where they began to train men properly again to shoot. Nothing like the scale of musketry that was achieved in the regular army before the war, but a better standard of musketry, let's say in that period of the last 100 days of the Great War. So I think these features that we look at a rifle, and if we look at the way kind of weaponry is depicted in modern films, I mean, I love the film 1917, as listeners to this podcast know, but the modern way soldiers are carrying Lee-Enfields in that film isn't that accurate. If you look at the wartime pictures, they carry them in a certain kind of way, and it's not in a modern way. They're not handling firearms in a modern way, and kind of firearm safety with fingers away from triggers and all that kind of stuff, you don't see that really. And I don't think soldiers were taught to use weapons in that kind of way. But it is a fascinating question. And the rifle, for a soldier, an infantry soldier in the front line, it's his most important weapon. And of course, it wasn't just the Lee-Enfields. There were the long Lee-Enfields, the Boer War period rifles used in some of the territorial and new army battalions. I remember seeing a whole load of those found on the battlefields of Loos many years ago when the ground there was cleared. And then other nationalities used different weapons. The Americans used the Springfield, and I've seen at Jean-Paul de Vries's museum down at Romagna in the Meuse-Argonne examples of those that he's found in the fields, and Ross rifles used by the Canadians as well for a period in 1915, and some units still using it in 1916. So I think that obviously a soldier was attached, often quite literally, to his rifle, but perhaps not in the same way as a collector of those rifles. And I know from a collector's point of view, it's nice to have kind of provenance with it. A friend of mine bought a deactivated Lee-Enfield that had a butt disc on it from the artist rifles. So this was almost certainly one of the weapons that was used to train up officer recruits, the artist rifles being a kind of officer training unit by 1916-17. So you can have that kind of connection. But I think all the other features and the manufacturer's side of it, I'm not so sure that soldiers were really even very aware of that during the Great War. But a fantastic story. And I think infantry weapons and the weapons of the ordinary soldier is something that I think we need to, at some point on the podcast, have a really kind of deep dive into. So thanks for that question, Matt. Question 2, also on email, comes from Mario. And Mario asks, what was the process for dealing with captured enemy soldiers from the Allied side and the German side? So I guess what you're asking there is, when a soldier was taken prisoner, kind of what was the process? Well, there were lots of circumstances at different points in the war in which men could be captured on the battlefield. In those battles of 1914, when the fighting was at close quarters and positions were overrun, whole chunks of units were taken prisoner. And when trench warfare came along, it wasn't uncommon with raids that an enemy force would come over and grab a soldier or multiple soldiers and drag them back across no man's land to question them for intelligence purposes, and they would subsequently become prisoners of war. And in some of the big battles, when attacks were made, positions were captured, soldiers would be taken prisoner and they'd be taken off into captivity. And then you see certain periods of the war where there's a lot of prisoners of war. German offensives of March 1918, when on the 21st of March, thousands of British soldiers were taken prisoner as the positions around places like Saint-Quentin and Quentin were completely overrun by German soldiers. And you see that again in the Lys offensive of April 1918 on the Chemin des Dames in May. 27th of May 1918 is a day that you see repeatedly in prisoner of war records. So there are these periods in which there are prisoners, and of course this applies to both sides of no man's land. So what happens? Well, when a soldier is captured, he's stripped of his weaponry. If he's got any sense, he'll have dropped that already anyway. They would take off his military equipment, just in case there were any other kind of secondary weapons in there. Then he would be searched, his pockets would be torn open and gone through, and personal papers taken out. He would keep his paybook generally, and obviously his identity discs, and he might be allowed to keep certain private things, but anything of value was quite likely stripped off him by whoever had taken him prisoner at that particular point. They would normally allow the soldier to keep steel helmet if that's that period of war, because it offered protection to the soldier, and then they would be led off by a covering party who would take them back to a position where these prisoners of war could be processed. Now, on the battlefield, that was a rudimentary kind of system. I remember Alf Rosell, who was captured near Pelve on the 3rd of May 1917. He was led off by a small group of Germans, and that's when he saw his old pal, Bill Hubbard, lying wounded in a shell hole and tried to convince them to get him away as well, but that wasn't possible. And then he went off into a prisoner of war cage close to the battlefield, and that's where his main process of becoming a prisoner began, and he went off to various camps in Germany. And having interviewed several Great War veterans who were taken prisoner on the British side by the Germans, then that was a common kind of process. And once they got to one of these prisoner of war cages near the battlefield, they would then be interviewed by often German officers who would ask them some questions. When you read the accounts of prisoners, they never give up detail. When we look at the records, we see that wasn't always the case, that they did often give up information, because a soldier as a prisoner is a very scared individual. He has no idea what's going to happen. And as much as possible, if he's wise, he will probably be compliant with the enemy. I'm not saying they blabbed Haig's top secrets at the first opportunity, but of course they might just give away some localised, vaguely unimportant information just to keep their captors happy so they could be left alone. That wasn't uncommon, and you read that in the accounts of prisoners of war in both world wars kind of taking place. And then they'd be taken further back. Now, the Germans often kept British and Commonwealth prisoners within France and Belgium to do work behind the lines, which they shouldn't have done. I've read this about battlefield medics, Royal Army Medical Corps men, quite frequently. Whether this was a period in which the Germans were lacking their own medical personnel, that could have been a reason behind it, but generally they were sent off to Germany for processing and further interrogation sometimes, particularly if they were officers, and then they were sent to a prisoner of war camp. And there were separate camps for officers and men. Generally the camps for officers were better conditions than those for men, where there were big huts, lots of men living in these huts. And if you read Richard van Emden's book, Prisoners of the Kaiser, then that kind of gives you a good insight into how tough the life of a prisoner of war, British prisoner of war in Germany was. And again, those ones that I interviewed who were there, they were in terrible conditions with almost no food. One of them had his leg amputated because of his wound in March 1918, and he was forced on crutches to go and work in a salt mine, for example. So they were not treated very well. And then at the main camp, the first main camp they went to, a representative from the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, would be there They would get them to fill in a form with their military details of their next of kin, and then the Red Cross would contact the family to tell them they were at this prisoner of war camp or this location. And those records are now online in the International Red Cross Prisoner of War Records Archive, and you can go on there and put a name in, and you can look up details of prisoners of war, find out when they were captured, where they were captured, and which camps that they went to. So that's really kind of useful information. The treatment of German prisoners captured by the Allies, and I can only really talk about the kind of British and Commonwealth experience because that's the one that I've researched. I guess there's a kind of separate study for the French side of things, but generally they were treated very well. And once they got back into kind of rear echelon areas behind the lines, their life was a lot better than the experience of British prisoners of war captured by the Germans in the similar kind of circumstances. And those that were taken back to camps in Britain, and there were places all over Great Britain where these camps were located, their life was pretty cushy, really, and they had a very good kind of experience, again, in great contrast to the experience of British prisoners. And thousands of British soldiers died in Germany during the First World War while in captivity, particularly towards the end of the war when food was very, very short, and that was the beginning of the kind of influenza period as well. So that was the kind of process, really. And there are these records that can kind of piece this together. So if you've got a relative who was a prisoner of war, you can find out quite a lot about them. And there are some great memoirs of soldiers who were captured that kind of give you an insight into this as well. There's a great one by a guy called Nobbs, who was an officer in the London Rifle Brigade, who was captured at Loy's Wood, captured and blinded. And there's an account of his war, which I used in one of my books on the Somme Combles, about the London Division and the fighting there in September of 1916. But there's loads of others, quite a lot of POW memoirs that were read by the generation of schoolboys in the interwar period who would go on to be prisoners of war in places like Colditz in World War II, and they greatly influenced their kind of mindset about escaping, for example. So again, prisoners of war, just like the rifles and infantry weapons, prisoners of war, fascinating subject, which I'm sure, once again, we will return to. Our third question comes from RJB on Discord, and he asks, what was the process for recycling the shell cases used by either side, and were any captured enemy armaments recycled, repurposed for their own side's use? Well, again, this is a really interesting question. Kind of recycling is a big part of all our lives these days, and it was, to a degree, no different during the First World War. Even Britain, with its vast empire, did not have endless resources, and salvage, particularly as the war went on and on, became more and more important. So what you see in the British records is a development of a whole system of salvage where, rather than just leave stuff on the battlefields, and when we look at archaeology by battlefield archaeologists like Simon Verdigam, and we see how much material that they found, and the diggers at Bosinger as well, for example, you think there can't have been any salvage during the war. But even though they're finding a lot of material, the British Army during the war was salvaging a lot of equipment. So if you think of an attack, when an attack has gone forward and men have been wounded, there would be rifles, kind of going back to our first question about weapons, there would be rifles and Lewis guns and handguns scattered all over the place where soldiers have dropped these. And sometimes when that battlefield had been cleared and the dead had been buried, the weapons and sidearms and equipment would be taken off the dead and piled up, and salvage teams would salvage them. So those rifles would go back to the base, for example. Let's say they're clearing up an area and they find a couple of hundred rifles, and there are pictures in the Imperial War Museum photo archive showing kind of piles of rifles being put together on a battlefield before being sent back to the base. And at the base they'd be cleaned up by armourers, they would be repaired if needed, and then they'd be reissued to soldiers that would come to some of the base depots. So some units, some men arrived with older pattern weapons like the long Lee Enfield, and if they got to Rouen in the early period of the war, there was a supply of the latest short magazine Lee Enfield, many of which may well have been salvaged from the actual battlefields. So that kind of salvage went on, but not just of weapons. They salvaged just about everything. Everything that could be recovered and reused was reused. And again, when it comes to the dead, there is evidence from some of the archaeology that I've seen over the years that they removed pretty much everything that they could from dead soldiers because the dead didn't need this kit, and then it could be reused by living soldiers on the battlefield to continue that journey to victory. In some cases, they took boots off. Most cases, they took steel helmets off and reissued those. I remember seeing a trench grave where only a couple of men had helmets, and when you looked at the kind of injuries they had head wounds, and I think the helmet was kind of holding that head together, so no one wanted to remove that particular helmet. So that stayed with the soldier, but the others had all been taken away for salvage. And there were salvage dumps on and near the battlefield the longer the war went on. And you get to 1917-18, and they're a vital part of the kind of infrastructure of the battlefield. And an army salvage branch was formed in 1918. And there are records of the huge amount of material that they salvaged, reused, and repurposed. And even on a kind of ordinary soldier's basis, there was this kind of recycling. I mean, one of the veterans I interviewed, Harry Redhead, he was in the Liverpool POWs battalion. He had gone to France, and he was carrying still his original leather pattern, 1914 pattern leather equipment, which he didn't particularly like. He wanted to get a set of webbing equipment, and after the first day of the Somme, when the Liverpool POWs had gone over the top and suffered substantial casualties, there were piles of webbing equipment that some of them had got near to the dressing station, so he went and helped himself to a set of that. It was dark by the time he picked it up. He just kind of dumped off his own leather gear, picked up the webbing, and made his way back to his billets. And when he got back to the billets, and he went into one of these kind of barns where there was probably lanterns or candles lit, so a kind of dim light, he realised that the webbing equipment was covered in the blood of the guy who'd been wearing it. And when he looked at the name that was stamped or written on the webbing equipment, it was a guy that had been killed in action that day. So kind of sent a bit of a shiver down his spine. So there's that kind of salvage going on as well. What you see, answering your question to do with repurposed and recycled weapons, you don't see so much of that on the British side. So we don't capture German weapons and reuse them. And I think it was only very late on in the war that they began to train soldiers how to use enemy weapons, so that when you captured a position and there was a Maxim gun there, you knew how to operate it, turn it round and use it against the foe, the men who'd previously been firing it at you. On the other side, the Germans seem to have been slightly more ahead with that. And there's a well-known photograph in Martin Middlebrook's book, for example, First Day of the Somme, with a group of German soldiers carrying away captured Lewis machine guns. Now, they didn't have, that was an air-cooled weapon. They didn't have an equivalent of that. They had an MG08-15, which was a water-cooled light machine gun, quite heavy, had to have a condenser tin to keep it water-cooled. So the Germans seemed to quite like the Lewis machine gun and capture it at any and every opportunity. On Hawthorne Ridge, on the 2nd of July 1916, there was a truce when both sides came out into no man's land to bury the dead, recover the wounded, and the British spotted the Germans using stretchers to carry away Lewis guns that had been dropped on the field of battle. And the Germans seem to have rechambered those from 303, which of course is an ammunition they didn't have, to 7.92, and they used them in some of the captured tanks that were captured at Cambrai in 1917 and used again in the spring of 1918 in various offensives. So that kind of thing did happen in the German side of it. It's an interesting subject. I mean, I don't know of anything that's kind of written as such on this. I mean, I think there's been some studies on salvage, but the reuse and the use by soldiers of enemy equipment is something that I would kind of more associate with the Second World War, when battle schools were established in places like Italy, for example, to train men up on enemy weapons. But it's certainly, yet again, and thank you, RJB, an interesting question that's kind of led us down a lesser known avenue, communication trench, if you like, of the Great War. And if you go on the Imperial War Museum photo archive and type salvage in, you'll come across lots and lots of salvage posters that went up to remind soldiers to salvage equipment because it was so vital to the war effort. So a fascinating subject, and thanks for that question. Our fourth and final question comes from Peter S., also on Discord. He says, what is your opinion about the following? The horticulture on Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries is often praised, and for a very good reason. But often you see that the flowers are so abundant that it's difficult or even impossible to read the headstones. With private inscriptions, it is often the same. My opinion is that the readability of the headstones should come first, always, with inscriptions the same, especially because some families had to pay a lot of money to get the inscriptions on, so I guess it should be always visible. What do you think? Well, Peter, it's an interesting question, and I've seen this over years. I've visited graves where the inscription has been obscured by some kind of bush or plant that's there, and occasionally even kind of reading details on a headstone. I went to the grave of Lieutenant Colonel Fisher, who was a Wiltshire officer the other day in La Touré Military Cemetery, and he was killed commanding the 12th Battalion York and Lancs Sheffield City Battalion, I think in October 1916, when they were holding that part of the front before they moved back down to the Somme to take part in the final phase of the Somme in November 1916. And there was a really beautiful plant on his grave, but it was obscuring the inscription on his grave, and I had to pull it back slightly to read it properly. So that kind of thing goes on. And I think if I look at the kind of plantation in cemeteries, there's been kind of a full circle gone on. If you look at interwar images, there's a heavy plantation of plants and shrubs and all kinds of horticulture. And if you get to the kind of 90s, there's less of that, narrow borders and things like that. But since the last kind of decade or so, and certainly since the centenary, I think you've seen a return to that kind of interwar policy of heavy plantation. And I like that because it really creates the proper English garden effect. And when I was out this week looking at some of the cemeteries, they were alive with the natural world, with birds, with animals, and with bees and insects. And that is really important. I think that they aren't just memorial gardens, they are parts of the natural landscape. And it's really important to have that feature. But I take your point about the kind of obscuring of personal inscriptions and details on headstones. And I think ideally that needs to be avoided at all costs. But then I look at the interwar photographs, and it seems to be just as kind of busy in terms of horticulture as it is now. So that must have been an issue for the parents and the daughters and the sons and the wives of soldiers going over. Also kind of had to push back a rose bush or a plant or something that was there to read an inscription. So I guess we kind of have to find the right balance between those two things, really. The ultimate creation of the English garden effect, and also the accessibility and readability of what is on the headstone itself. And of course the Commission, now having moved away from using powerful chemicals to clean headstones, has resulted in a very different kind of cemetery experience when we go to those cemeteries. And there's lots of posts about this on social media. But again, if I look at the kind of interwar period photographs, you see the same kind of standard on headstones as I'm seeing at the moment. And if you think about it, the pictures from the 1930s are 20 years after the cemeteries were built. They weren't using chemicals to clean graves in the same kind of way in those days. They were using more kind of natural methods, I would guess. So you see a kind of build-up of verdigris and headstones looking, in inverted commas, dirty. I mean, I don't have an answer to this. I'm not a stonemason. I'm not an expert on what happens to stone in an open, natural environment. But if we look at the kind of central ethos of the Commission, which is to preserve the memory of those who are buried in its cemeteries or named on its memorials, and also the fundamental principles of what the Silent Cities were about, which was the combination of a place where the memorial tablet, the headstone, could be placed, and placing that into an English garden to create that English garden effect, then there has to be a kind of union of those ideas so that they come together in the right kind of way. So I guess this is an ongoing thing that we'll see as the whole new experience of the way the cemeteries are maintained moves forward. And I think it's right to hold the Commission to account over this, but I think that kind of criticism has to be voiced in the same way. And your approach to this, I think, Peter, is absolutely kind of spot on. It's important that we get this right, that the memory of what those men stood for, the sacrifice that they made, and how their own family, through the personal inscriptions, reacted to the grief, the loss of that soldier. That all needs to be visible for future generations, because it's all part of the language of remembrance, the language of grief associated with the First World War, and all part of the kind of wider culture of these cemeteries and the Old Front Line itself. And I'm sure and I know that this is a subject that we will return to again, probably in Q&As, if not a main episode of the podcast. So thank you, Peter, and thanks to all of our friends of the podcast who've sent questions in for this episode. More soon, and keep sending those questions in via the Discord server and via email, and there's links for both of those in the show notes. So see you again soon on the Old Front Line for more questions and answers. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.